this is truly the most remarkable piece of reporting I have read in a long time. I honestly cannot recommend it highly enough. What you report is that no sooner did the slave owners, businessmen of the South, lose the Civil War, then they turned around and in complicity with state and local governments and industry reinvented slavery by another name. And what was the result?
Well, the result was that by the time you got to the end of the 19th century, 25 or 30 years after the Civil War, the generation of slaves who'd been freed by the Emancipation Proclamation and then the constitutional amendments that ended slavery legally, this generation of people who experienced authentic freedom in many respects, tough life, difficult, hard lives after the Civil War, but real freedom in which they voted, they participated in government.
They farmed.
They farmed. They carved out independent lives. But then this terrible shadow began to fall back across black life in America that effectively re-enslaved enormous numbers of people. And what that was all about, what that was rooted in, was that the Southern economy, and in a way the American economy, was addicted to slavery, was addicted to forced labor, and the South could not resurrect itself. And so there was this incredible economic imperative to bring back coerced labor, and they did on a huge scale.
You say they did it by criminalizing black life.
Well, and that was a charade, you know. But the way that happened was that, of course, before the Civil War, there were slave codes, there were laws that governed the behavior of slaves, and that was the basis of laws, for instance, that made it where a slave had to have a written pass to leave their plantation and go and travel on an open road. Well, immediately after the Civil War, all the Southern states adopted a new set of laws that were then called black codes, and they essentially attempted to recreate the slave codes. Well, that was such an obvious effort to recreate slavery that the Union military leadership that was still in the South overruled all of that. Still, that didn't work. And by the time you get to the end of Reconstruction, all the Southern legislatures have gone back and passed laws that aren't called black codes, but essentially criminalize a whole array of activities that it was impossible for a poor black farmer to avoid encountering in some way.
Such as?
Vagrancy. So vagrancy was a law that essentially, it simply, you were breaking the law if you couldn't prove at any given moment that you were employed. Well, in a world in which there were no pay stubs, it was impossible to prove you were employed. The only way you could prove employment was if some man who owned land would vouch for you and say he works for me. And of course, none of these laws said it only applies to black people, but overwhelmingly they were only enforced against black people. And many, many times, thousands of times, I believe, you had young black men who attempted to do that. They ended up being arrested and returned to the original farmer where they worked in chains, not even as a free worker, but as a slave.
And the result, as you write, thousands of black men were arrested, charged with whatever, jailed, and then sold to plantations, railroads, mills, lumber camps, and factories in the Deep South. And this went on, you say, right up to World War II.
And it was everywhere in the South. These forced labor camps were all over the place. And the records that still survive, buried in courthouses all over the South, make it abundantly clear that thousands and thousands of African Americans were arrested on completely specious claims, made up stuff, and then purely because of this economic need and the ability of sheriffs and constables and others to make money off arresting them and then providing them to these commercial enterprises and being paid for that.
Another reason is, I just think as you talk, another reason is that anybody who raised these allegations or charges or wrote about them when I was growing up were dismissed as communist. You know, if they'd been from the Wall Street Journal, it might have been a different take. Right?
Well, I think there's some truth to that. Anyone who tried to raise these sorts of questions was at risk of complete excoriation among other white Southerners. But that's also what's remarkable about the present moment. And one of the things I've discovered in the course of talking about the book with people is that there's an openness to a conversation about these things that I think didn't exist even 10 or 15 years ago.
What has been the response to it?
Well,
Americans don't like to confront these pictures, these stories.
They don't. But over and over and over again, I've encountered people who've read the book, who email me, or they come up to me after I talk about it somewhere, particularly African Americans, who African Americans know this story in their hearts. They may not know the facts. They may not know exactly what the scale of things were, but they know in their hearts that this is what happened. And so people come up to me and say, Gosh, the story that my grandmother used to tell before she died 20 years ago, I never believed it, because she would describe that she was still a slave in Georgia after World War II or just before, and it never made sense to me, and now it does.
It is amazing that this was happening at a time when many of the African Americans retiring today were children.
Exactly. Exactly. And so, again, these are events, unlike antebellum slavery, these are things that connect directly to the lives and the shape and pattern and structure of our society today.
Does it explain to you why there might be so much anger in the black community among, let's say, African Americans who are my age, 73, 74, who were children at the time this was still going on?
Well, there's no way that anybody can read this book and come away still wondering why there is a sort of fundamental cultural suspicion among African Americans of the judicial system, for instance. I mean, that suspicion is incredibly well-founded. The judicial system, the law enforcement system of the South, became primarily an instrument of coercing people into labor and intimidating blacks away from their civil rights. That was its primary purpose, not the punishment of lawbreakers. And so, yes, these events build an unavoidable and irrefutable case for the kind of anger that still percolates among many, many African Americans today.